May 1st, 1960, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers flies a perilous top-secret mission behind the Iron Curtain.
It was going to overfly some targets that had never been seen before.
He's piloting the greatest spy plane ever built, 70,000 feet up, where the sky merges with outer space.
At that high an altitude, there's a very small margin for error.
But when the Soviets discover him, they open fire with a deadly new weapon.
They were tracking the plane from the moment it entered Soviet airspace.
Time and luck have run out for Powers, the U-2, and U.S.-Soviet relations. In the history of man, there are critical chapters that forge together a daring individual, a crucial situation, and an innovative technology. Fate's fusion of man, moment, machine. May 1st, 1960. American CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers is about to propel a top-secret spy plane into enemy territory and ignite an international firestorm. As he prepares to take off, rumors swirl that the Soviets have finally gained the capability to shoot down the plane once thought to be untouchable. Hi, I'm Hunter Ellis. In the 1950s, the specter of communism hangs ominously over the American public, and with it, the threat of nuclear war. A risk that compels the U.S. government to take bold steps to guard national security. During this anxious time, the United States strives to gain as much intelligence as possible about Soviet military capabilities.
President Eisenhower does not want another Pearl Harbor. He's fearful that the Soviets are developing some very advanced bomber aircraft that can penetrate American air defenses.
On March 5th, 1953, a stroke kills Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, and a new leader, Nikita Khrushchev, brings the promise of a thaw in relations with the West.
Khrushchev talks about peaceful coexistence. There is this very dangerous risk of nuclear war, which would annihilate all of us. We have to get along.
In this more hopeful climate, President Dwight D. Eisenhower proposes his Open Skies Treaty at a 1955 summit held in Geneva, Switzerland.
So he makes his Open Skies proposal that each side be able to fly over the other country, monitored by the UN. Khrushchev is very suspicious of this and assumes that there's some ulterior motive on the part of Eisenhower.
Eisenhower hopes full knowledge of each side's capabilities can head off an arms race fueled by speculation and paranoia. But despite Khrushchev's refusal, the president persists.
It was important for the United States to be able to see what was actually on Soviet airfields. There was a bomber gap that was building based on intelligence reports that suggested that the Soviets had a very large air force that was capable of delivering nuclear weapons.
In a calculated gamble, Eisenhower approves a top-secret plan to develop high-altitude spy planes that can fly over the Soviet Union and monitor its military capabilities.
What he wants is an aircraft that is immune to Soviet fighter aircraft, immune to Soviet missiles.
The project is given the code name Operation Aquatone by the CIA. It requires an aircraft with extreme capabilities. An aircraft that at the end of 1954 doesn't yet exist. Now it must be produced at breakneck speed.
We needed an aircraft to carry a camera to 70,000 feet, to fly 4,000 miles over the Soviet Union and have them not realize that it had ever happened.
Lockheed's Advanced Development Project Unit and its brilliant chief designer, Kelly Johnson, create a high-flying miracle. They produce an airplane that is singular in its capabilities and radical in its design. A select group of seasoned Air Force pilots is recruited by the CIA to fly these top-secret reconnaissance missions.
Have you thought about what you're going to do after the Air Force? No?
They said they had an unusual project. They didn't identify themselves fully, and would you like to get out of the service and do something unusual? And that seemed reasonable.
I have a program that will allow you to serve your country well into the future.
In clandestine hotel room meetings, the eager, patriotic pilots are introduced to the cloak and dagger world of the CIA.
When I found that they were asking us to get intelligence on the Soviet Union, I was excited, and I loved it.
Gentlemen, as I'm sure most of you are aware, we've been trying to photograph Russia for years.
The first meeting was just to test you out, to give you some hint what the mission was about. It sounded pretty exciting for a fighter pilot.
It's really a jet-powered glider. What do you call that bird? Nothing publicly. This is all top secret. But we've coined the phrase Utility 2, or U-2.
I ain't never seen anything like it.
The first U-2 flight over the Soviet Union occurs on July 4th, 1956. The plane takes off from an Air Force base in Wiesbaden, West Germany, on a mission to photograph Soviet military sites. When the plane crosses the Soviet border, it's technically committing an act of war.
But Eisenhower's pretty smart. He knows that the Soviets probably will not protest because they can't do anything about it. And for the Soviets to say there's an airplane flying over our country and we can't do anything about it, that's going to be too embarrassing. And that's exactly what happens for the next 4 years.
The Soviets track the flights with radar, but American U-2s fly over the USSR with impunity, beyond the reach of surface-to-air missiles and Soviet MiG fighters.
I saw fighters below me by about 10,000 feet were circling around like a bunch of bees. And I just grinned and said, "So long, fellas."
This enabled us, for the first time, to look down into the Soviet Union, to look at the missile silos, to look at ground forces, to look at areas that we had only limited glimpses of through sending in human assets and other technological collection methods.
In 1956, U-2 photos reveal that American cities and citizens are not in as much danger as previously believed.
Some thought that there were over 800 bombers that were sitting over in communist Russia, and in fact, there were probably only 100 or 2.
Reassured, Eisenhower does not order a dangerous buildup of U.S. bombers, but instead focuses on warmer relations with the Soviet Union.
Our common purpose should be, as always, a just, universal, and enduring peace.
In a bid to further ease tensions, a May 1960 summit is set up in Paris between the U.S., its allies, and the USSR to discuss ways of reducing the nuclear threat to the world.
And so this would be perhaps the first occasion when there would be some sort of major accord between the two countries.
Nonetheless, in advance of the summit, President Eisenhower wants unequivocal verification of Soviet military capabilities. He orders one more U-2 flight, dubbed Operation Grand Slam. It's a decision that will haunt him forever.
It was the most important mission because it was going to overfly some targets in the Central Soviet Union that had never been seen before.
This extremely dangerous mission will be the first flight to traverse the north-south axis of the Soviet Union, nearly 3,000 miles. It is hoped the operation will confirm the locations of several Soviet long-range missile sites in the northern USSR that could threaten the U.S. mainland. With the summit looming, the mission takes on a new urgency. It will take a pilot of extraordinary skill and fortitude to fly the U-2 on this deep and bold invasion of Soviet airspace. The pilot selected for the mission is Francis Gary Powers, the most qualified U-2 pilot at the time.
He had a wonderful amount of energy. He was very patriotic. He believed in what he was doing. For him, a chance to fly a new top-secret airplane for the CIA was something that all pilots would jump at to do
Powers is confident, but what he doesn't know is that the Soviets have set a trap for him. For years, U-2s have flown high enough to be safe from attack. Until now. Operation Grand Slam, a 3,000-mile spy flight over the Soviet Union, has been ordered by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. The man chosen for this all-important assignment is top U-2 pilot Francis Gary Powers. The moment is imminent. As an urgent directive from the president calls for the mission to be launched, it's now or never. The machine the mission hinges on is the high-flying U-2 Spyplane. If anything goes wrong, it may undermine years of diplomatic efforts between the U.S. and the USSR, who are trying to step back from the nuclear precipice. May 1st, 1960 is the last day the flight can be launched. The mission will be the longest and most dangerous U-2 flight ever. Francis Gary Powers is developing the perfect blend of skill, experience, and confidence that will put him in the pilot seat of a historic flight. Fate has tapped 30-year-old Powers, the most experienced U-2 pilot in the program, to fly the mission. Everything in his life has been leading him to this moment. Powers is born on August 17, 1929 in Burdine, Kentucky, the heart of coal mining country. The difficult and dangerous life of a coal miner is one that his parents don't want for their son.
They wanted their son to succeed, and they always heard that doctors made good livings. So they encouraged my dad to take medical classes.
Long before he's old enough for college, though, in 1944, 14-year-old Gary convinces his father to let him take an airplane ride.
So he takes the biplane ride, he falls in love with aviation, so this is how we knew he was going to be an aviation person.
Pressured by his father, he studies medicine, and in 1950 graduates from Milligan College in Tennessee. But soon, the escalating conflict in Korea draws Powers to the military.
He had a wonderful amount of energy, he was very patriotic, he believed in what he was doing.
Although he doesn't fly any combat missions, he still gains extensive experience piloting the most advanced military aircraft of the time. Powers and other pilots are recruited by the CIA for the U-2 project.
Look at her.
They're looking for pilots with lots of experience in aircraft, pilots that can pass the psychological exam for the U-2, and people that they feel are going to be very reliable.
Frank, please have a seat.
In an age of increasing paranoia and mistrust, the CIA doesn't take any chances with its pilots.
Do you have any objections to taking a lie detector test?
No.
The idea was to get the very best. It was also really essential to assess them psychologically. This mission over the Soviet Union was a high-risk mission. There was the possibility they would be lost if they were shot down.
Are you, or have you ever been, a member of the Communist Party?
No.
Over the next 4 years, Powers flies 27 operational U-2 missions and logs hundreds of hours in the plane before being selected for Operation Grand Slam.
Gary Powers is chosen because he is the most experienced U-2 pilot in the program at the time.
For the fateful May 1st mission across the Soviet Union, Powers will be on his own for 9 hours. No food, no sleep, no human contact, even via radio.
Psychologically and physically, flying a U-2 on a long reconnaissance mission is very stressful. You add to it flying over hostile territory where they're going to try to shoot you down. It can be exceedingly strenuous.
In his survival kit, Powers carries one item that signifies the stakes of the mission. It's only to be used in a worst-case scenario.
Frank? Colonel?
You might want to take this just in case.
Why, is there a toll?
No, it's more serious than that.
Hidden inside a U.S. silver dollar is a poison pin. If he's captured, Powers has the option of taking his own life.
It was suggested that if you're caught, you will be interrogated and tortured. So this is a way to alleviate the pain and suffering should you be tortured.
Have a good flight.
At this remote U-2 base in Pakistan, Powers prepares for the mission. The early spring sun is searing, even at 5 in the morning. As he waits for the launch signal, it becomes clear there's a delay. President Eisenhower is holding up the mission as he weighs the risk. He must decide if the intelligence the flight will collect is worth threatening the summit with Khrushchev and dashing hopes of a possible nuclear arms reduction treaty.
Right up to the time of the summit, President Eisenhower is interested in whatever latest intelligence, the most timely intelligence that we can obtain right up until when the summit takes place.
Powers is dehydrating on the blistering tarmac. If the order isn't given soon, he will be physically unable to fly the mission. Considering the disaster that's fast approaching, that would have been fine by Powers. A perilous spy-plane mission is in standby mode, in advance of a summit between the United States and the Soviet Union. The man called upon to risk his life in the flight is CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers. The moment is the most ambitious overflight of the Soviet Union ever undertaken. The machine, now prepped for takeoff, is the state-of-the-art in aircraft technology, the Lockheed U-2.
The U-2 is one of a kind. At the time it was built, it was almost impossible to shoot down. It had such a high altitude, no weapon was made that could actually go up there and catch it.
Powers is ready to go. But now he sits, rapidly dehydrating on the runway, waiting for White House approval.
President Eisenhower personally approves every U-2 flight over the Soviet Union. There are stories, and I got this from General Goodpasture, who was his military aide, that Eisenhower would take the maps of the Soviet Union, put them on the floor of his office, and make the CIA people explain why each target was important.
Finally satisfied with its absolute necessity, the president gives Operation Grand Slam, the perilous 3,000-mile mission over the Soviet Union, the go-ahead. If all goes well, Powers will land in Norway 9 hours later, with critical intelligence on Soviet nuclear missile capabilities. The mission itself would not be possible without the incredible machine called the U-2. The U-2 is essentially a set of amazing cameras built into a jet-powered glider. Powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J57 P37 engine with 10,000 pounds of thrust, the U-2 has a maximum airspeed of around 430 miles per hour, far from supersonic. Flying at these relatively low speeds allows the plane to stay aloft for nearly 9 hours without refueling.
A very lightweight aircraft, and because it had a large wing area, it could sort of just soar over the Soviet Union.
The first U-2s carry in excess of 1,300 gallons of jet fuel in their 80-foot wings, but have a range of nearly 5,000 miles. Fully loaded with the fuel, the plane weighs in at 12 tons, 25% less than a similarly sized jet fighter, an F-104. To allow the plane to fly at extreme altitudes, designers build the U-2 with ultralight aluminum. As a result, it can withstand only 2.5 Gs. That's half the strength of most military aircraft at the time.
The pilots of the U-2 noted that everything seemed thinner than they were used to. The tail was held on with 3 bolts.
For the U-2, every extra pound means a loss of altitude, which brings the plane that much closer to the enemy.
The focus on weight control was simply because altitude was life. You had to stay high. You had to stay away from the air defenses.
Flying a U-2 at 70,000 feet is an incredible achievement by aviation standards. A pilot needs a lot of training and equipment to be able to operate in this environment. This is the latest pressure suit worn by U-2 pilots during their missions. Each suit costs $150,000, but it's the same basic technology that's been used for more than half a century. Today, I'm at Beale Air Force Base in California, where I'm going to suit up and step inside an altitude chamber that simulates the extreme conditions a U-2 pilot experiences while flying a mission. The instructors have filled a container with liquid to illustrate the effects of high altitude.
When the suit starts to pressurize, starts to get a little mushy, we're gonna zip on up.
62,000 feet, 63, 64.
At 65,000 feet, the lack of air pressure creates a vacuum that causes liquids to boil, including blood.
There it goes. So now, if I didn't have the protection of my suit, that would be my blood right there, correct? Wow.
Once at the desired cruising altitude, the U-2 airspeed tolerances are unforgiving. The slightest variation can have tragic consequences. Pilots call this narrow window of maneuverability the coffin corner.
We had to maintain our airspeed within 5 knots of the correct number. And if we went over that, the airplane would try to roll out of control. If we got under that, 5 knots under it, the engine would quit.
Training for the first U-2 pilots is as dangerous as any actual mission. 8 U-2 pilots are killed within an 18-month period in 1957 and 1958.
For the early pilots, it was get up there and do it right, or you're dead. And unfortunately, we lost a large number of our pilots.
During early flight tests at Groom Lake in Nevada, the U-2 easily breaks world altitude records.
At that high altitude, you can see the curvature of the Earth and the black sky and the bright blue band of the horizon. It was quite impressive.
Each U-2 is a technological wonder, but they also have some quirks that make them a challenge to fly. For example, because of the bicycle landing gear, which means there's only 2 wheels on the fuselage, these pogos are necessary to support the wings during taxi and takeoff. In an unusual feature designed to save weight, the pogos actually fall off the plane as it takes off on its steep ascent.
We didn't use full power on takeoff. The airplane practically leaped into the air, and it would climb almost vertically.
As groundbreaking as the flight characteristics of the U-2 are, the photographic capabilities are just as amazing. 2 custom-built cameras in the plane can take pristine pictures of objects just a few feet long from more than 13 miles up.
U-2 has a panoramic camera which oscillates and gives you a wide swath of the ground. The other is a tracking camera, which gives you just a very narrow track so that you can see precisely where the U-2 has been flying.
The U-2's main camera uses a 36-inch lens to achieve resolutions of 100 lines per millimeter, 4 times as powerful as conventional aerial reconnaissance cameras of the day.
On some of the early camera experiments, they were able to identify the width of white lines painted on a parking lot.
The revolutionary aspheric lens corrects any distortion caused by the camera angle and the curvature of the Earth at these tremendous heights, permitting extremely accurate measurements.
The camera is as amazing as the aircraft is.
Each of these unique cameras carries a roll of film, 9 inches wide and almost a mile long, enough to photograph 2,000 miles of territory. But they don't run automatically. For each mission, U-2 pilots are told exactly when and where over Soviet territory to turn on the cameras. So how were the photo interpreters able to tell what the Soviet Union was doing based on these photographs here?
Well, we would fly over many airfields at once. And then on an airfield like this, we could count exactly how many bombers they had at the time. And several other airfields would not have any bombers on them. So it wasn't really matching Khrushchev's claims at bomber production.
So they're moving them around, playing a shell game, so to speak.
Exactly.
after many delays, the mission is finally ready to launch. May 1st, 1960 at 6:26 a.m. Francis Gary Powers embarks on his historic flight, lifting off from a top-secret airbase in Peshawar, Pakistan.
As he crosses into the Soviet Union, he clicks the button on his mic. This can be picked up by U.S. radio receivers, but that's the only communication the U-2 pilot will have with his base.
Powers is in a communications blackout as he begins the long trek over Soviet airspace.
The moment you cross the border, you sense the difference. Knowing there were people who would shoot you down if they could created a strange tension. Were they at this very moment trying to bring me down?
Powers' U-2 is tracked from the moment he enters Soviet airspace. The Soviets have been aware of these flights since they began on July 4th, 1956, but until recently have been helpless to stop them. The day chosen for the flight, May Day, adds insult to injury.
May 1st is a very important day in the Soviet Union. The communist state is a state of workers and peasants. This glorifies the workers this day. It's traditional that Khrushchev and all the top leaders gather in Red Square. Khrushchev gets woken up about 6 in the morning. His phone rings. Chairman Khrushchev, there's a U-2 over the Soviet Union. Khrushchev is outraged. How dare they do this to us? Especially on today, May 1st, May Day. You have got to get that plane down.
When the Soviets learn of the U-2 overflights back in 1956, they accelerate the development of their anti-aircraft defensive capability. By 1960, they roll out the V-75 Davina, a deadly surface-to-air missile capable of reaching a U-2 at 70,000 feet. The Americans dub it the SA-2.
It is a missile very simple in design so that the Soviets are able to produce thousands of them and install them all over the Soviet Union. It has the speed and the altitude to get a U-2.
Some in the U.S. government feel that a shoot-down is not a matter of if, but when.
Secretly, in our hearts, we knew they were going to get one of us one of the days.
Now, armed with a system that can reach the U-2, the Soviets have Powers in their sights and prepare to end this U.S. menace once and for all. A top-secret CIA flight over the Soviet Union is gathering information on never-before-seen Soviet military sites. The man at the controls is Francis Gary Powers, the top pilot in the program. The moment that could change the nature of the Cold War is rapidly approaching. The machine making it all possible is the American aerial wonder, the U-2 Spyplane.
We had to know what their bomber program really was, what their missile program really was, and only the U-2 could bring that back. We could get it by no other means.
Sometime around 7 a.m. local time, Powers is discovered by Soviet radar. The Soviets track Francis Gary Powers in his U-2 Spyplane for over 1,000 miles. As he passes over the large city of Sverdlovsk, he is unaware that his years of training are about to be put to the test.
Я приказываю сбить самолет. Сбить немедленно!
Powers tries to reach the detonator to destroy the incriminating cameras and film.
He can't reach it because centrifugal force is now pulling him away from the controls.
Worse yet, he can't move his legs out of the way of the ejection seat.
If he ejects from the aircraft, he'll lose his legs.
My father finds himself spinning down towards the ground in the wreckage. He falls from 70,000 feet down to 30,000 feet before being able to bail out of the aircraft. And his parachute opens automatically at 15,000 feet.
Powers also knows his cover's been blown to pieces. He tries to get rid of any damaging evidence, including the silver dollar that contains the poison pin.
He opens the silver dollar. Now imagine the presence of mind, takes out the pin and puts it in his pocket and flips the silver dollar aside.
The pilots were never under any orders to commit suicide or use the pin. It was at their option and their discretion. It could also be used in case of escape. You're one person between my father and freedom, a quick prick, and off he goes.
Powers lands hard in a farmer's field outside the Soviet city of Sverdlovsk.
Смотрите, парашютист!
He's rushed up to by farmers. They help him with his backpack, his parachute, his helmet. They start to ask him questions in Russian.
С тобой все нормально? Американец?
The farmers soon realize Powers is not a Soviet pilot.
My dad doesn't speak Russian, so he shrugs his shoulders. This makes one of the farmers nervous. They hold a pitchfork up near him. My dad communicates to them in the dirt, USA, so they know he's an American. Moments later, the black car shows up. Two men get out.
Американский пилот. Хорошая работа, мы будем проверять. Спасибо.
They put him in the back seat and take him to a holding area in the central part of town.
Powers isn't trained to handle a situation like this because the CIA doesn't expect a U-2 pilot to survive a crash.
To have something happen such as a missile goes off in the vicinity of the aircraft, damages it enough that it is coming down, but that the pilot does have time to get out, was not the expectation.
Within 6 hours, Powers is flown to Moscow, where intense questioning begins. He believes that revealing his real mission would likely get him executed.
What is the name of your unit?
Detachment 1010.
Air Force?
Civilian. Civilian pilots working for the Air Force.
Where is this unit located?
Incirlik.
Incirlik? Where is Incirlik?
Adana, Turkey.
Turkey.
He's trying to mislead his captors outright, make sure that he doesn't give away secrets.
How many U-2s in Incirlik?
4, maybe 5.
How many pilots?
7.
What are their names?
Look, I'm not going to tell you their names.
We already know their names, so just tell us what their names are.
Well, if you've already got this information, then you don't need me now, do you?
But it's soon clear to the Soviets what the real purpose of the U-2 is. They salvage the cameras and film and the malfunctioning mechanism designed to destroy both.
An unarmed plane, a U-2 weather research plane based at Adana, Turkey, piloted by a civilian, has been missing since May 1.
Back in the U.S., the government is in damage control mode, claiming that the U-2 is just a weather plane and the pilot blacked out at high altitude, accidentally veering into Soviet airspace.
The United States is taking this matter up with the Soviet government with particular reference to the fate of the pilot.
Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev plays his hand perfectly.
5 часов 36 минут по московскому времени
Американский самолет пересек нашу границу и продолжал полет вглубь советской страны.
May 5th, he announces to the world, we have shot down this U-2 plane. That's all he says. He doesn't say anything about the pilot.
Certain that Powers hasn't survived the shootdown, the U.S. government sticks to its cover story.
2 days later, May 7th, he announces, we have the pilot alive. He's in our custody. We're questioning him. We have the plane. We have all the plane equipment. We have the maps. We know many things now.
President Eisenhower is now forced to admit that the United States has been spying on the Soviet Union.
We must have knowledge of military forces and preparations around the world. Secrecy in the Soviet Union makes this essential.
Eisenhower's admission obliterates any semblance of goodwill between the superpowers.
Peaceful coexistence with the West and the issue of where to devote domestic resources, how much to put into the military or not, both of these really big policies for Khrushchev, he felt were dealt a mortal blow on May 1st.
As a result of the incident, the May 1960 Paris summit collapses and Powers is thrown into prison. He spends the first few months in solitary confinement.
Prison life was very depressing for my dad. He was very concerned that he would never get out of this thing.
August 1960. Powers is put on trial in Moscow for the entire world to see. His parents and wife are in attendance, and Powers defends himself as best he can.
I realize the Russian people think of me as an enemy. I plead with the court to judge me not as an enemy, but as a human being who is not a personal enemy of the Russian people.
As the Soviet judges deliberate Powers' fate, most believe he will be found guilty. What's less clear is the sentence: prison or death. Moscow, August 19th, 1960. An American pilot is on trial after his U-2 Spyplane is shot down over the Soviet Union. The man is Francis Gary Powers, on a mission approved by President Eisenhower. He is now facing espionage charges. The moment is the daring spy mission over secret Soviet military sites, which has turned into a diplomatic debacle. The machine is the U-2 Spyplane and its cargo of incriminating cameras and film, now in Soviet hands. It's clear from the start that Powers doesn't have much of a chance for leniency. The Soviets want to make an example of him. Many are even calling for his execution.
Садитесь, пожалуйста.
Expert. After 3 days of damaging accusations and testimony by the Soviet authorities, Powers' fate is revealed. He is convicted and sentenced to 10 years in jail and sent to Vladimir Prison in central Russia to serve his term.
And the longer he's there, the more despondent he becomes, the more depressed he becomes. And in his journal and diary, you can see how the handwriting will go from relaxed and leisurely to very tensed and scribbled and frantic.
He writes a letter to his wife describing his growing despair.
The way I feel now, I would much rather have stayed with the airplane and died there than spend any time in a prison. To take away one's freedom is worse than to take one's life.
Back home, Powers' father Oliver presses for his son's release. Against all odds, he hopes his tireless efforts will initiate the first high-profile spy exchange between the Cold War adversaries.
My grandfather writes a letter to Rudolph Abel, who is a prisoner in a federal penitentiary in Georgia, serving a 30-year sentence for espionage against the United States.
Soviet spy Rudolph Abel, a man Powers has never met, now plays a pivotal role in his possible release.
Well, Colonel Abel had been one of the Soviet Union's most senior, most effective intelligence officers in the United States. He was in New York at the time of of his arrest.
So my grandfather basically point blank asks, who should I talk to about a swap, you for my son who's now in the Soviet Union?
The quest that begins with a father pleading for his son's life finally reaches fruition. The U.S. government embraces Oliver Powers' idea as a way of putting the damaging U-2 incident behind them. February 10th, 1962. After nearly 2 years in Soviet prisons, misfortune gives way to good fortune. Powers is brought to the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, where the West and freedom are just a few hundred yards away.
Stop here. Go on ahead.
My father recalls talking to one of the people who met him that if something goes wrong, I'm jumping over the bridge instead of going back. So he was adamant that he would not let this opportunity for freedom pass him by.
It's good to see you.
You remember me?
Murphy.
That's right. Hey, just to be official, what's the name of your dog?
Charlie.
You're Francis Gary Powers.
Mr. Powers, next time you come to visit us, I hope you come to visit us as a friend.
Next time, maybe I'll come as a tourist.
At the exact moment that Powers crosses to the west, Rudolf Abel walks in the opposite direction towards East Germany. The two spies pass each other at the midpoint of the bridge without saying a word.
Welcome back.
Great to be back.
Thanks.
Powers returns to the United States late in the evening of February 10th, 1962. Despite his ordeal, Powers discovers he's been the target of harsh criticism. Many say he should have destroyed the plane and the photos and committed suicide.
This very, very courageous young man had done the very best he could, and yet it was as if his government sort of grudgingly recognized his great contribution.
Finally, during a testimony at a Senate intelligence hearing on March 6, 1962, Powers is praised by many senators and given a standing ovation.
The way he handled himself in the crash, the way he handled himself in the subsequent arrest procedures, the subsequent trial, I find that he was just an outstanding American.
After leaving the CIA in 1962, Powers becomes a test pilot for Lockheed, working again with his beloved U-2 planes. In 1976, when Lockheed stops building U-2s, Powers takes a job as a traffic helicopter pilot for a Los Angeles television station. On August 1st, 1977, at 47 years old, a mechanical failure brings his chopper down. Sadly, Francis Gary Powers doesn't survive this fall from the sky.
Dad, first and foremost, was a pilot. He loved to fly. He never considered himself a hero. He always considered himself a man in a very particular situation that he would do exactly the same again if put in the same situation.
On May 1st, 1960, man, moment, and machine intersect, and Francis Gary Powers is shot from the sky, changing the Cold War forever. It may be just a missile operator's lucky day, or the inevitable consequence of a desperate diplomatic strategy. Whatever controls this M3 factor, it's a mysterious thread weaving its way through history, one that will continue to unravel on Man, Moment, Machine.